Hello, U.S. history students. Today we shift our attention um, to a U.S. president who will be basically the poster child of the modern day Republican Party. And so we are shifting into the decade of the 1980s and the presidency of Ronald Reagan. Um, President Reagan's background is quite interesting. He has the political background as he was governor of California during the late 60s, during a time of a lot of social turmoil, of course, across the country that was taking place in the 1960s. He ran for the presidency a couple of different times, but was selected to be the Republican Party candidate in the 1980 election. He eventually ended up serving as a two-term presidency and was very influential in the decade of the 1980s and as generally just shaping the Republican Party. His time in office is the beginning of what historians refer to as modern conservatism or the neoconservatives, neo meaning new. And the neoconservative movement was very much a reaction, very important here to recognize this, a reaction to the social changes that had been taking place in the decade of the 1960s and into the 1970s. The new conservative movement began to speak out against what they saw as the extreme extension of civil rights that we had seen during the Warren Court era of the Great Society, with protection of accused criminal rights, the reduction of the ability of public institutions to require or to require religion in public schools, or the support of religious activities by state and local governments. The neoconservatives are going to speak out in opposition to that, saying we should move back to school prayer, to more Christian principles in American society. We should move away from support of gay rights. We should limit abortions rights that had been guaranteed in the early 1970s through the Roe v. Wade case, and that the government needed to be shrunk in size and stop spending so much on social programs and intruding into people's lives. Ronald Reagan is kind of famous for a saying that he used on the campaign trail, that he said that the most feared words in the American language was, "I'm here from the government and I would like to help," because in his viewpoint, big government was the danger to the United States and that it would restrict people's rights. And so, as a result, a dramatically large coalition of conservative supporters around the country grew from differing backgrounds in some ways, but also some commonalities between them. There was a number of conservative publications that were created at that time, conservative intellectual leaders, a lot of business leaders that were angry about high taxation in the country, and also the expenses that were connected with big business relating to environmental protection laws that had been put into place that were costly for them to implement. Also, as I mentioned with our lecture over the 1970s and President Nixon, the economy was in bad shape in the 1970s, and really people were struggling. American industry was declining, and a lot of people were out of work. There was really high unemployment, and people were seeing themselves fall out of the middle class. And as a result, they started to turn more to these conservative leaders who said that their methods would promise more economic growth. The socially conservative white Southern Democrats and fundamentalist Christian groups, they flocked to the Republican Party during this time, and the party became almost completely, which it is today, composed of white voters. As minority voters turned more and more to the Democratic Party and the policies that had really been started all the way back. I think if you go back to Franklin Roosevelt during the Great Depression, but then in the years after that, with um, Pre- President Kennedy supporting civil rights reforms in the early 1960s, and then, of course, Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society programs that he created that were instrumental in improving the lives of, um, of minorities across the country. Those those voters from minority groups, African American, Latino American, almost exclusively were drawn to the Democratic Party. And the conservative movement becomes more and more focused on moral kind of conservative viewpoints as well as economic conservative viewpoints. And almost exclusively, these kind of moral groups were coming out of really strong fundamentalist Christian backgrounds, but also a lot of support was growing out of the southern part of the United States and almost completely white voters in the South because black voters were supporting the civil rights reform policies of the Democratic Party. So this is all a continuation of that big shift that I mentioned with President Nixon called the Southern Strategy. And the major ideas of the neocon movement you can kind of see here. They promoted cutting government spending and size, promoting traditional moral values. They were anti-feminist. They were anti-abortion, pro-life, anti-gay policies, anti-drug policies, supporting strong punishment for criminals, supporting capital punishment and its extension of executions for capital crimes, pro-gun ownership. This is when you really start to see the growth of the National Rifle Association in the United States. And their policies economically were basically cut government spending, shrink government taxation and regulations, and then that would stimulate economic growth, but also to keep military spending strong and keep American defense high. That's always been a strong policy of the conservatives from Nixon, or excuse me, from, well, Nixon, I think too, but also from Reagan on, became kind of a hallmark of supporting military spending. They also had this kind of new voice that had emerged with a group called the Moral Majority, and these were conservative religious groups and leaders who espoused the moral values of the Republican Party conservative movement. And there was a real strong growth during this time of what they called televangelists, TV pastors, TV preachers, which there's still some of that today. Of course, you may be familiar with it. And in fact, President Trump today gets a lot of support from this same kind of group. This is something that has been a strong component of every um, Republican Party president from Reagan on, which would be particularly President Reagan, both President Bushes, but particularly the second President Bush, and then, of course, now President Trump. But the criticism has always been that a lot of these vocal supporters of moral values in many cases have not really completely followed those same moral values themselves. You know, they've been charged with criminal activities in terms of abuse of contributions to their churches. Some of them have had affairs. All the kinds of things that they speak out against. It's always been kind of interesting to contrast that with the values that they espouse. In the election of 1980, President Reagan won in a dramatic election. He didn't win a large amount of the popular vote, which shows again kind of the division within the country. He only got 51% of the popular vote, just a little over half, and only 52% of people that were voting age actually voted in that election. But look at the range of his victory. He won all but 4 states during that election. And I think when you think about that, it shows that there was a real strong range of support for him, clearly across the country. His opponent, by the way, which I didn't mention, we've kind of skipped over, is President Jimmy Carter. Kind of a lack of time for us to deal with President Carter during this odd COVID-19 semester. But he was clearly a president that people were drawn to, and his message was that America was a great country, a strong country, and that his idea was to make America great. That was kind of the slogan that he went by, which is interesting because, again, President Trump has kind of pulled on that and have used the Make America Great Again kind of slogan. And I do think it's a throwback to those values of Reaganism that Trump's party was trying to appeal to because Reagan was such a popular president. He begins his administration with a dramatic series of cuts in government spending on what we think of as entitlement programs. They're called entitlements because you are guaranteed them based on your economic situation. So entitlements, things that you get would be like Social Security. You're entitled to it once you retire. You're entitled to Medicare when you reach the age of 65. You're entitled to Medicaid if your economic situation allows you to qualify for it. So the idea of entitlement programs. And you can see the kinds of things that were cut. They cut food stamp programs, all sorts of welfare benefits, job training programs, Medicaid, school lunch programs, student loans for people going to college. All this stuff was cut. And the biggest groups that these cuts are going to hit will be the lower classes, lower economic classes, much harder than the middle class and above. And they say that statistically, because of the reduction in all the welfare programs, this group that was the single hardest hit were single working mothers that had small children because the programs in place to benefit them were cut at the highest rates. So in terms of his opposition, President Reagan was seen by many people as kind of the enemy of the working classes because of his policies. Now, so what happens? The idea of his economic cuts, this is the key thing. And in this, if you understand this, you will understand basically the Republican Party's goals that have been in place since the time of Reagan. And here is the idea. The idea was referred to as supply side economics or trickle down economics. And the idea is that if you cut taxation on big business, then they will have more money available and they will create more jobs. Once they create more jobs, the people working in those jobs will be paying taxes on what they are earning. So that would cause tax revenues to increase. Even though you cut taxes overall, you would still have more people working and earning because unemployment would go down, et cetera, and that would cause revenues to still stay high for government revenue. So and plus you're cutting government spending on different programs, so you wouldn't need as much government revenue. So Reagan signed a 25% tax cut into place that was spread out over 3 years. All this is called supply side economics, trickle down economics, or Reaganomics. And it's called trickle down economics because the idea is that if you cut the taxes at the top, and the people at the top will create jobs and programs, that eventually the money will begin trickling down to the people at the bottom, and eventually everybody will see benefits from those tax cuts. So what happens as a result? Almost immediately, there was improvements, at least on the surface. Interest rates went down dramatically. The stock market rose dramatically because the people with money, with wealthy, had a lot more money to invest. The inflation rate dropped dramatically from about 14% to 4%, which is unreal. We've lived through a time where you guys don't even really notice like high inflation because prices have been generally low, in terms of their price increase over your whole lives. But think about the reduction of the cost of items for the general consumers. However, the government revenues did not increase because taxes were cut so low. And the US government also during this time, because they supported the idea of large military, huge military spending did increase. And so the government borrowing did increase to cover what the government was expending on the services it was providing because not enough money was coming in from taxation revenue. Later, this all leads to more inflation and increased interest rates. And one of the things that a lot of people forget about Ronald Reagan is that in his second term of office, he was convinced that they had to raise taxes. And eventually, they did raise taxes in his second term quite a bit. Not so much income taxes, but other kind of taxes were raised. So that's one of the things I think a lot of people forget. During the Reagan years, the national debt grew dramatically from $900 billion to almost $4 trillion. And by the time Reagan was out of office, the United States was the world's leading debtor nation, which it still is today. We owe more money to our debtors than any other country in the world. And interest payments on the national debt, was 20% of the national budget by the end of the Reagan years. And I think it's probably pretty close to that still now, although the national debt is way, way higher, in 13, 14 trillion dollars, I believe. Right now, it may even be a little bit higher than that. The other big part of the Reagan years in terms of those expenses were the big military buildup. Remember, this is the Cold War still, and Reagan is credited with kind of spending the Soviet Union into calling off their conflict with the United States. The US had invested millions, actually, I should say trillions of dollars into our military. One of the big expenses was the Strategic Defense Initiative, or what was nicknamed Star Wars. It was the idea of trying to put missiles and lasers onto satellites up in space that could be used to shoot down incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs. We built big new nuclear missiles. The Peacekeeper missile system was put into place, multiple warheads on these missiles that could target multiple sites. The B-1 bomber, which you might be familiar with if you've ever seen them fly out of the airfield over in Missouri. They were created at that time, and $30 billion makes each of those aircraft down here. This is a B-1, cost $393 million each. So these expenditures were a big part of why the US budget deficit is going to increase during that time. So a little bit of a mixed bag with Reagan. We'll talk about him a little bit more later in terms of the end of the Cold War, which he's very significant with. But otherwise, that's it for this today.